Hey guys, in this lesson we're going to be talking about how to find the discriminant. The discriminant is the part of the quadratic formula that tells us the number of real solutions that any quadratic equation will have. Now remember, the quadratic formula is just one of the ways that we have in order to solve a quadratic equation. And the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac and all of that divided by 2a. The discriminant would be the part that's underneath the radical. That would be the b squared minus 4ac part. To determine the discriminant, we want to make sure that our equations are in standard form. That would be ax squared plus bx plus c. That way we're able to identify the values for a, b, and c, and then we can substitute those into that particular part of the quadratic formula. And then we want to simplify underneath the radical. Now when we're simplifying, if we end up with the square root of a negative number, that's going to tell us that we have no real solutions or no real roots. If we're taking the square root of 0, that would mean that we have a double root, or just one answer. And if we're taking the square root of a positive number, that means the discriminant is positive, that tells us that we have two distinct roots or two different solutions. Let's take a look at this first example. Here we have m squared plus 5m minus 6, which is in standard form already. So we're going to identify the values for a, b, and c. A is 1, b is 5, and c is negative 6. Now that we've identified those values, let's plug them in or substitute them into that part of the quadratic formula, the b squared minus 4ac part. So for b squared, we're going to have 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6. And let's simplify. 5 squared is 25, and when I do negative 4 times 1 times negative 6, we get positive 24. And if we were to combine those, that would give us positive 49. We're taking the square root of a positive number, so this would mean that our discriminant is 49, and that we would have two solutions. And the square root of 49 would be positive or negative 7. Let's look at the next example. Here we have s squared plus 8s plus 16. Again, this is already in standard form, so let's find the values for a, b, and c. A would be 1, b would be 8, and c would be 16. Now let's substitute those into the part of the discriminant. So b squared would be 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 16. 8 squared would be 64, and when I do negative 4 times 1 times 16, that would give me minus 64. And when I simplify, that's going to give me the square root of 0. So that tells me that my discriminant is 0. Because we're taking the square root of 0, that tells me that I'm only going to have one solution, and the square root of 0 is just 0. Now for c, we want to find the discriminant. Before I can do this, I've got to add the 6 to the other side so that it is in standard form. So in standard form, my equation would be 3f squared plus f plus 6 is equal to 0. Now I can find the values for a, b, and c. A would be 3, b would be 1, and c would be 6. And now we're going to substitute in these values into our equation. So we have b squared minus 4ac. For b squared, we're going to have 1, so 1 squared, minus 4 times 3 times 6. 1 squared would be 1, and then negative 4 times 3 times negative 6 would be minus 72. So my discriminant here would be negative 71, which means that we would have no solutions here, and the square root of negative 71 is not possible, so no square root. Let's take a look at an application problem. So here we have, as Darius is skiing down a ski slope, Jorge is on a chairlift. Darius stops directly under Jorge and attempts to toss a disposable camera up to him. If the camera is thrown at an initial velocity of 35 feet per second, the equation is h equals negative 16t squared plus 35t plus 25, where h is the height and t is the number of seconds. If the chairlift is 25 feet above the ground, will Jorge have 0, 1, or 2 chances to catch the camera? Well, we could use the discriminant to solve this problem. We're going to replace h in our equation with 25 since the height between the ground and Jorge is 25. So h equals negative 16t squared plus 35t plus 5. Now we need to subtract 25 on both sides so that we have our equation in standard form. So here we would have negative 16t squared plus 35t minus 20. And now we can use the discriminant. So a would be negative 16, B would be 35, and C would be negative 20. We're substituting our values into the part for the discriminant, which would be b squared minus 4ac. B squared would be 35 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times negative 20. 35 squared is 1225 minus negative 4 times negative 16 times negative 20, which would give me negative 1280. And then if I were to subtract those, I would end up with the square root of negative 55. So that tells me that my discriminant is negative 55, which means that there would be no solutions to this problem. So if Jorge were to toss up the camera, or were to try to catch the camera, he would have no chance of catching that camera because it would never reach him. This is how we find the discriminant, and this is how we apply it to real-world situations.